Good evening and welcome back to Q&A live from Docklands, Melbourne. I'm Tony Jones. It's great to be back in 2017 and here to answer your questions tonight. Policy analyst Helen Andrews, the Premier of Victoria Daniel Andrews, Menzies Research Fellow Daisy Cousens, climate activist Xiuhtezcatl Martinez, who's in Australia for the National Sustainable Living Festival, and the Minister for Environment and Energy, Josh Frydenberg. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. It's live everywhere else on News 24 at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Time. And you can watch and listen live on iView, on Facebook, Periscope and ABC News Radio. Well, our first question tonight comes from Charles Pegham.
Will Cory Bernardi's new Conservative Party have the same effect that Trump did in America? And if so, will it pull votes away from both major parties, specifically the Liberals, and lead to Labor victory or even another hung parliament?
Josh Frydenberg, that's one for you.
Well, I don't know what Cory's going to do. Obviously, I've seen the speculation. If he is thinking...
Well, he's leaving by the speculation and he hasn't denied it.
Well, the point that Cory needs to reflect on is he is in the parliament by virtue of the endorsement of the South Australian Liberal Party. He's always been treated courteously within the Liberal Party, and our party resembles that broad church of views, whether it's classical liberalism, the John Stuart Mill variety, or whether it's conservatism, which is the Edmund Burke variety. And there is a home for people like Cory Bernardi in our party. Now, whatever decision he takes, I'll just have to wait for that to provide a formal comment.
Well, it sure looks like Bernardi is the first Liberal defector. If you have more, will the Turnbull government literally unravel?
Look, we're very unified and we know what the job is ahead of us. Obviously, we've got a big agenda in this new year to prosecute, particularly around driving down the cost of living and jobs. And you heard the Prime Minister in his press club speech talk about the importance of energy policy, housing affordability.
Now, Josh, you're going to have time to talk about the stump speech stuff later, but this is about, I mean, a crisis has now emerged in your ranks. You're about to have a defector. If you have another one from the House of Reps, if, for example, George Christensen decided it was time to up stumps and join Cory Bernardi's new Conservative Party, you'd have to perhaps go to an election because you'd lose a majority in the House. That's how tight the situation is. Are you not at all concerned?
Well, you're right. Votes are tight, but we do have a majority on the numbers. Now, George Christensen's made it very plain publicly he's not about to leave the Liberal Party. You're right, there's been silence from Cory Bernardi, but we can't comment on that until we actually know what he's going to do and, if so, where he's going to go.
And when he leaves tomorrow, what will you say then?
Well, well, in the event that he does leave, obviously we have a long association with Cory Bernardi and it's somebody who we think we can work with, but let's just wait for any formal announcements from him.
Okay, Dan Andrews.
Well, Josh has turned up tonight and his timing's everything and he's walked straight into Cory Bernardi leaving his party and leaving his government. But look, I don't know Cory Bernardi. I know about some of his views though, and I don't agree with, well, probably anything that Cory Bernardi necessarily puts forward. I think it's a pretty hateful agenda. I think it's an agenda that doesn't resonate with working people. It doesn't resonate with people who are fair-minded and I think embody that Australian spirit of a fair go. So the question from Charles was, would it resonate? I think that sort of extreme conservatism that is the exact opposite of that fair go that I think all of us cherish will not resonate, whether Cory Bernardi is a leader of that Conservative movement or anybody else for that matter. I think Australians have got much bigger hearts than that.
I'm just going to go back to Josh for a minute before we hear from the rest of the panel. Now, you would have seen the photos of Cory Bernardi when he was in the US essentially on the government payroll.
At the United Nations.
At the United Nations.
He's a big fan of the UN.
You would have seen him during the presidential election wearing his red cap with Make Australia Great Again, which, of course, does remind us of Make America Great Again, the red baseball cap. I mean, it wasn't obvious to all of you that he's actually modelling himself now on Donald Trump?
Well, obviously, he's been a big fan of Donald Trump, his campaign, and now his presidency. But I think it's wrong, as Daniel was trying to line up people like Pauline Hanson and her supporters and Cory Bernardi and their supporters, to line them up and say they have no place in Australia, because in fact hundreds of thousands of Australians are actually voting for them. So you've got to listen to the message. Why are people voting with them? Why did people vote Donald Trump when he was so different to any other candidate we'd seen before? He threw out the rule books when it actually came to political candidates, and now in the Oval Office he's got a very different standard operating procedure than anyone before him. And I don't think we can dismiss that and take a holier-than-thou approach. I think we have to listen for the causes, react to them, and do so in a much more sympathetic way than maybe we have today.
So you're saying he's no longer a dropkick, your turn?
Well, I've said subsequent to that my comments should have been a little bit more judicious, and I think, Tony, everything I say tonight is subject to extreme vetting.
Okay, let's go across to Helen Andrews. Now, is Australia ripe for a Donald Trump figure, given what Josh was just saying?
I think Australia is ripe, but I don't think Cory Bernardi is leaving the Liberal Party because he wants to be the next, the Trump of Australia. I think he wants to prevent a Trump in Australia. Now, among the many things that Donald Trump destroyed in his journey to the White House, one of them was conservatism, because he's not a conservative. He's an economic nationalist. He's a protectionist. He's a populist. Now, Cory Bernardi's social views eat up all of the media, but he's actually a very committed small government conservative. He likes low taxes. He's not a protectionist. So I think if you're someone who believes the things that Cory Bernardi believes, and believes in small government rather than populism, and you see all of this discontent in the public, you don't want that channeled towards a populist party like One Nation that's going to throw up tariffs. You want it channeled towards genuine, principled conservatism. So I think that's his game.
Daisy Cousens, what do you say?
Look, I don't necessarily think Australia's ripe for its next version of Donald Trump. I don't think it's a good idea that Cory Bernardi leaves the Liberal Party at all, because I think whatever you think of his views, all those voices are necessary. All voices should be heard from both sides of the debate, so you can pick and choose from the middle all the best ideas, combine them, and then you've got a policy. I don't think it's a good idea he leaves, because he provides that kind of balance, and he is a representative in the government of that voice, which needs to be heard. So I hope he doesn't leave. I really hope he doesn't. If he does, I'm interested to see what happens.
Now, I'd have to say, among young people that I know of, you're a bit of an outlier in that you actually like Donald Trump, or you are sympathetic to Donald Trump's presidency. I mean, how did you come to such a different conclusion than so many other young people, without in any way disparaging your view?
Look, the way you have to understand Donald Trump is that he's kind of like that weird relative that everyone has that comes over once a year at Christmas, who's nice, but occasionally he says things that just make you go, oh God, no, sorry, he didn't mean that, but ultimately you kind of forgive him because he's nice and he gives you the best presents. That's the only way you can understand Donald Trump. As Helen says, he's not a conservative, he's not a Ted Cruz who wanted to abolish the IRS, which is just weird. He was a big win for the millennial conservatives because of his stance on political correctness and free speech, which are the two main concerns of millennials. I don't like everything that Trump does. I don't like all of his policies. I mean, like, as with any politician, but I do like his stance on that. I do respect his stance on that. And he's of that school of thought of sort of being more socially libertarian in a funny sort of way, which a lot of young conservatives are, because the times have moved on. We're not clinging to sort of old traditionalist values anymore. I think he's a valuable voice. I think his presidency will either be the best 4 years in American history or a complete disaster. There will be no in between. And I'm excited to see what happens.
Okay, we'll come to you in a moment, because I want to hear what you think, since you actually live in America. But let's hear our next question from James Sewell. It's on the same topic.
Hi, everyone. The stark contrast between our Prime Minister's report and President Trump's tweet following their 25-minute conversation last week highlighted just how unconventional of a politician he is. While we might vehemently disagree with many of his attitudes and policies, many people find his unashamed bravado to be refreshing in the current political climate. My question is, are there lessons that progressive voters and politicians can learn from a Trump presidency?
I'm going to start with Xiuhtezcatl. Now, do you find him refreshing in any way at all?
I think it's like that like when you're trying to sleep and then someone just dumps a bucket of cold water on you, but ice cold water, and then it wakes people up. I think that's the only successful thing that Trump has done in representation and for the American people is woken people up and brought people together. We are thankful to him for bringing over 3 million people worldwide together the day after his inauguration to stand in the streets and demonstrate the fact that we are not going to stand for a hateful, racist bigot that is a tyrant that isn't going to bring out values of what the United States represents. And if, for me, looking back at American politics, we haven't really had a politician that has truly represented the voices of people everywhere. And I think it's not refreshing.
But that's exactly what Donald Trump says he's doing. He's representing, he says, the voices of the forgotten Americans, the silent Americans, the ones who haven't had someone representing their views. Well, I mean,
if you want to look at Americans that have not had their voices heard and have not been represented in politics, you can look at communities and people of color. You look at Black communities, Latino communities, immigrant communities from Mexico and from all over the world, people that have come to the United States, and those are the voices that have not represented, and that is not the community that Donald Trump represents or stands to protect or stands to bring anything towards.
Josh Frydenberg. So, thank you very much. So the question was whether there are lessons for progressive voters and politicians that they can learn from the Trump presidency, or the experience of the fact that he has actually been made president. I mean, you touched on this in your last answer.
He tapped the discontent in Middle America, and one of the things that fueled the rise of Donald Trump was the fact that the average wage of working class Americans had been stagnant for 3 decades. And so there was a growing wealth and greater working poor. And there was a disconnect between Wall Street and Washington and the broader population. I think that's what he tapped into, and that's obviously what's driving him to success going forward. So he's going to focus on infrastructure spending in the towns, in the cities, which has been neglected for too long. His whole protectionist, and we obviously disagree with his protectionist agenda, is all about creating more jobs at home rather than exporting them to other countries like China. And that's where his rhetoric and obviously his actions are taking us. But from our perspective, the message is, don't forget what is happening out there among the working population, and don't get too focused on what's happening either in Canberra or in Washington, because that's not the real world.
Yeah, can I just quickly go back to Xiuhtezcatl? Do you understand how he got enough voters to become president? And a movement, a genuine sort of movement of enthusiasm and against mainstream politics.
I think it really brought out the fact that a lot of our country is still incredibly stuck in a mindset, in a way of seeing things that is very, I think, not in alignment towards where the world needs to be headed in 2017. And in the future, I think that people got sick of business as usual. And one thing that I can agree on is that Donald Trump is not your usual presidential candidate, and he is not your usual American president, where he did change a lot of things, and I think that's what people were attracted to. I think a lot of, especially young voters, kind of lost hope in the Democratic Party when after Bernie Sanders lost. I think a lot of young people that were incredibly excited in the same way that they turned out when Obama was elected president in 2008 and reelected in 2012. That didn't happen when Hillary was running against Trump. So the movement died down, and we allowed this to happen in the United States in a way. And I think even a lot of people that did vote for Trump are beginning to realize that, wow, a lot of these things that he said he was going to do, he's actually going to try to do them. And obviously they've been met with resistance, because the things that he stands for are not popular to American values, to people in the United States. Like, that is not in our best interest to ban people, to ban immigrants from countries all over the world from coming into our country. That is not a threat to our national security. And the immigrant ban was not about safety, and it wasn't about protecting our country. It was about hatred, racism, and kind of this discrimination against an entire religion of people. Like, that's not right anywhere.
In a way, you've anticipated our next question. I'll go straight there, and I'll get the other panellists to respond to it. But the next question comes from Omar Al-Kassab.
During the Arab Spring, when marching for freedom and democracy, I was shot, tortured by the Syrian regime, and forced to flee with family. Australia has kindly given us a new life, and after only 2 years of learning English, my brother has recently made the news when graduating as a dux of his school and currently studying to be a doctor. I'm also halfway through my business degree. Why would someone ban people like us from being citizens of his country?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'll just make the point that your brother, and we'll come back to him in a minute, but your brother is sitting next to you, Saad, is sitting next to you there. Saad, we'll come back to you in a minute if we can. And Helen Andrews, what do you say to that, that question? Here's someone escaping from a dictator in Syria, making a life in another country, but such people are currently being prevented from even entering the United States.
Yes, for a period of 90 days. At this point, it's extremely inaccurate to talk about a ban on anything. The Trump administration wants to put in place a new system of vetting for its refugee population, and it's going to take 90 days to put that together. So right now, we're only talking about a suspension. Nobody's keeping anybody out permanently.
So I have a question.
Sorry, Omar, I'll come to you in a sec. Omar just put his hand up quickly, so I'll just let him respond to that.
So the Syrian ban is indefinite. It's 90 days for everyone except the Syrian ban is indefinite ban.
Yeah. Sorry, Helen, do you want to respond to that?
Trump is going to put the refugee cap back to where it was during the Bush years, and he has said that in accepting refugees from Syria, which is 5 million people displaced, we can only accept 50,000. That given the limited number of slots America has, America should focus on people who are oppressed religious minorities, Christians and Yazidis. Whereas the Obama administration, of all the Syrian refugees that they let in, 99% were Muslim and only 1% were Christian.
So
Okay.
of the countries that were actually banned for the 90 days in this ban, not one people from these countries did not commit any kind of terrorist attacks on U.S. soil or kill any American citizens from any of the countries that he banned. But there were, I think, 3 or 4 countries that he did not ban that were largely Muslim countries where the terrorist attackers in the United States that have killed American citizens on U.S. soil did come from. And he didn't put bans on those countries because he does business with those countries.
Oh, no.
Okay,
No
so
part of that is true.
Absolutely untrue.
Okay, Trump doesn't do a lot of business in failed states. That's true. Not a lot of people do. But to claim that no refugee from those 7 countries has ever committed terrorism in America is simply not true. A Somali refugee stabbed 9 people at a mall in St. Cloud, Minnesota, while shouting Allahu Akbar until he was shot by an off-duty policeman and stopped. Another Somali refugee drove his car into a group of students at Ohio State University and then went on a stabbing rampage before he was stopped by campus security. Now, it may be that you don't count those as terrorist incidents because there were no fatalities, but the absence of any fatalities in those cases was no thanks to the attackers.
Okay, I'm going to bring in the other panellists, then I'm going to go back to our 2 brothers over here, but Josh Frydenberg wants to get in, then I'll go to the Premier and, of course, Daisy. So
Well, firstly, I think that's a wonderful story, and it's wonderful to see you in Australia and your brother doing so well. And I have to point out that it was then Prime Minister Abbott at the time announced that we were taking 12,000 refugees from Syria, which was greater than the number going into the United States under the Obama administration. And we get demonised as a coalition for our immigration policy, when in reality we take more people on a per capita basis from a resettlement from the UNHCR than any other nation in the world, and we have a number of women at risk coming to Australia in addition to our humanitarian program. Now, what Donald Trump did in the United States, to the point that Helen made, it is a 90-day process. Now,
So are you obviously Australia has undertaken some form of extreme vetting. Indeed, keeping people out of the country permanently is part of that. Are you sympathetic to what Trump has done?
well, he's the elected president of his country, and it's not for me to say what process is he going to adopt.
No, but I'm just asking, are you sympathetic to what he's done, given that
other than the Syrian case you referred to, it's a temporary procedure that he's going through. And what is interesting is that President Obama listed those 7 countries as countries of concern. Now, Theresa May has pointed out in the British Parliament that there are 16 countries, including 6 of those 7, that don't allow Israelis ever to visit their country. There are some double standards here that we have to call out. As for we have a non-discriminatory policy in our country. We have a proud humanitarian program, and obviously this is a temporary issue that Donald Trump hopefully will work through in the weeks ahead.
I'm going to quickly go back to Saad. Now, we heard from your brother that you've learnt only since, I think, 2014 to speak English. You've now become the dux of your school. So congratulations for that, first of all. I'd just like to know how, having escaped from Syria, where there's a dictator, how you reflect on this.
I mean, it's just like, I just want to say I'm really grateful at the start. I'm really grateful for the Australian people to give me the opportunity to come here and study and finish my study and give my family safety that we lacked in Syria. And I just want to say that I will work my hardest, to put Australian name up the sky. And I want to ask Helen Andrews, don't you feel guilty to put us with the bad guys in the same basket?
I'm sorry?
Like, don't you feel guilty to put us with the bad guys in the same basket when you're fair to...
The basket, with the deplorables, the deplorable basket.
No, I think, Helen, what he's saying is that the way he looks at it, I think, is they've escaped from a dictator, having tried to get democracy in their country, but now they would never be allowed to go into the United States. And so that's the point he's making. They're being put in the basket with, let's say, the ISIS people from Syria, the same basket, and yet they're people who fought against the dictator.
The same values as the American values.
Sorry,
we struggled for the same values as the American and the Australian values. Like, we actually also learned English by watching the Australian Parliament because we liked democracy and freedom in this country and in the US. So when we putting in the same basket with the bad guys, it's so hurting for us.
Okay, well, let's get Helen to respond to that since you've asked her whether she feels guilty about this.
I think Donald Trump and all Americans want to help everyone in Syria as much as they can, to the greatest extent that America can. But it's a simple fact that a dollar goes further helping refugees closer to the Middle East. You can help 12 people in the Middle East for the price of resettling one person in the United States. So it really doesn't make sense if you're a humanitarian to concentrate on a few people winning the lottery when you could help 11 more people closer to the site.
All right, now we haven't heard from Daniel Andrews.
With the greatest of respect, I think what doesn't make sense is that you, as the centre of freedom and liberty and democracy in our world, the United States, that you would not judge people by their character, by their conduct, by their abilities, by their commitment. You would instead judge them by the God they pray to, how they pray, where they were born, where their parents were born. And Australians have been caught up in this. Dual citizens, because of their parentage, born here, have been caught up in this. I've had the great pleasure to meet these guys at Parliament House last year, and this is one story among so many stories that in my role I'm privileged to be able to hear. Refugees given an opportunity, a second chance to build a new life, and they repay us in spades. And we're very proud of you, and we are so pleased to have you here.
Thank you. So we have to be able to get on with the show and keep the conversation going. So if you're going to clap, keep it brief. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. The thing about immigration is that it has tended to be sort of sentimentalized over the last, little while, and that's fair enough. It's an uncomfortable issue. It's an awful
So you don't
issue.
think that story was sentimental?
I think it was incredibly sentimental, but look at it this way. The US is currently, according to the FBI, investigating 1,000 cases of people who could be implicated in terrorist attacks. Okay, we've had 37 terrorist attacks, not all with fatalities, but as Helen said, a lot of people are injured. A lot of families and friends of these people have been injured as well. There have been a lot of survivors. For instance, at the Boston bombings, I knew of a girl, she's a dancer. She lost her leg. She lost her leg because of these people, there are facts to be considered here. It's not a Muslim ban. It's 7 countries. It affects 12% of Muslims around the world. That's not a racist thing. You know, no, it's not. It's not. If it were a Muslim ban. Settle down.
Sorry, please give her a go.
This is not to do with race. This is not to do with religion. This is to do with radical Islamic terror, which is the political ideology associated with Islam, which has absolutely nothing to do with you. I think your story is wonderful, and I think you should be allowed in. And I think this ban is incredibly sad because, as we've seen here, the troublemakers ruin it for the people who genuinely do need help. But countries have a responsibility first and foremost to their own citizens. It is a temporary thing. It will be lifted. I don't agree that there should be a permanent ban on Syrians. I don't agree with that at all, for all of the obvious reasons. But as Helen said, you know, it's a 1 to 12 ratio. It is cheaper to resettle people in the Middle East. It is safer. And Donald Trump, you know, from what I read, is actually in negotiations at the moment with the King of Saudi Arabia to instigate these. It costs $64,000 for the first 5 years for a refugee in the United States. That is the cost of, you know, of 12 in the Middle East. Hang on a second.
Just a very brief one, because it seems that we're going to be repaid many times over.
Many.
For people who actually enter the community, become ducks of their school, get jobs as scientists or whatever. Do you see that as a counterbalancing argument?
No, because, look, you've got to look at the facts here. You've got to look at the technicalities. Yes, of course, it will be repaid, but it takes a while. The average, you know, refugee who comes in has about 10.5 years of education, okay? It takes them a long time to get in. They cost a lot in welfare. It is safer to relocate them to Saudi Arabia, places like that. And to be perfectly honest, I'm appalled that Saudi Arabia actually has done nothing to help this refugee crisis. These are their people. And finally, this is happening. This is what we need to focus on. It is safer, it is cheaper. They won't get the cultural shock, they won't get the climate shock. It's not fair to go from Iran to Minnesota. That's not fun for anyone.
It's safe though.
We're going to...
So are safe zones. So are safe zones.
We could get stuck on a few of those points, Daisy, so I'm going to quickly move on to another aspect of this. We've got a question from Joanna Edmonds.
Excuse me. Josh Frydenberg, in trying to secure the transfer of refugees from Manus Island and Nauru to the US, the Australian government has had to encounter some of Donald Trump's worst prejudices, and I think we've heard some here tonight, that they are illegal immigrants, that they are security threats. Both of these are myths that successive Australian governments have happily peddled to us since 2001. So doesn't it make you blush to now have to admit, in arguing with Donald Trump, that these people are in fact legitimately pursuing fleeing for their safety and have been properly cleared as not security threats? And if they are safe to go to the United States, which we believe they are, why can't we bring them here?
Well, there's 2 points I'd make. The first is they actually haven't gone through that vetting process that the President has said that he wants to undertake before he takes someone from Nauru and Manus. And you're right, the Prime Minister has confirmed that the President said to him he'd honour the deal that was reached with Barack Obama. Now,
is it clear how long the extreme vetting process might take? I mean, could it go for years?
Well, it's not clear to me. It's not my portfolio responsibility, and obviously that is an issue that will be worked through in the weeks and the months ahead.
Is it something you worry about, though? I mean, if their form of... I mean, for example, he's not happy about the deal. If the extreme vetting were to last for years, which is potentially possible because we don't know what it means, what would you do?
Well, obviously we'd like to get a resolution for those people as fast as possible, but the point about our policy, and we've been unapologetic about it, and it is a harsh policy, is that when people were coming in an unauthorised manner by boat, that they would not be settled in Australia. It was not only our position, it was also Kevin Rudd. Now that meant when we came to government that we inherited thousands of people who were in detention. We've been successful in getting every single child out of detention and closing 17 detention centres and saving the taxpayer billions of dollars, and obviously people who otherwise would have died at sea, because more than 1,200 that we know of did die at sea.
Okay, Josh, now many of these arguments have been rehearsed.
Yeah, but they're critical.
No, they are important arguments, so I'm just asking, well, I guess what's a fairly simple question. Are you going to put some sort of deadline on this process? Because if it were to drag on and on and on, those people would be in permanent detention.
Well, Tony, you're asking me just days after the phone call between the Prime Minister and the President.
But would a deadline be a good idea?
No, I mean, the point is we will try to work with the United States on this issue as fast as
I
practical.
was going to quickly go back to our questioner. Joanna's got a hand up.
The issue is not whether on what the extreme vetting means. You've had to represent that these refugees have been properly vetted by Australia. You've had to represent that they are genuine refugees, that they are not illegal immigrants, that they are not security threats. How do you square that with not bringing them here?
Okay, I think you've sort of answered that, so I'm going to go to Daniel Andrews.
Well, look, Tony, this is a wicked problem. There's no doubt about that. But the question is, does the solution need to be equally wicked? And I've been praised by some and criticised by others for making what I think is a pretty obvious point. My focus has been on kids, and particularly those who are born here, and I've been pretty outspoken about us finding a way, all of us, for them to be able to stay. I think that's humane policy, I think it's good policy, and I don't think any of us should settle for the fact that wicked problems can only be dealt with by equally wicked solutions. I don't disagree with Josh. We don't want to see more boats coming out. I don't want to see deaths at sea. We don't want to see the carnage that was there for far too long. But surely we can work together, all of us, to try and find a more humane, a fair and just, and at the same time, a smart policy. For me, and this is, I'm unburdened by this because I'm a state premier, but for me at least, the starting point, the most important part of that discussion is those kids who were in fact born here. And I've said as much, and some have agreed with me and some haven't, but that's the conclusion that I've come to.
So do you think, just very briefly, should there be a time limit,
On the
deadline?
well, look, again,
on the vetting?
I often provide the Prime Minister with advice on all sorts of issues. I freely admit that. On this one, he was on the phone to the President, I wasn't, none of us were. If the deal's going to be honoured, that's a good thing. You were just in a... common sense tells you that ought to be orderly, that ought to occur sooner rather than later. I'd leave it for the Prime Minister and relevant federal ministers to put a timeline on it.
Would you happily take all those people into Victoria?
Well, we're already taking more than the 25% population share that we should if you were just to do the plain numbers. We are a welcoming state and we're stronger for our diversity. Our multiculturalism, Tony, is
with
our
respect,
greatest strength.
that's not an answer to the question.
Well, they haven't. Those people are in the process, we believe, of not heading to Victoria, but
all right.
heading to the United States.
I'm not going to keep going on that because we do have other questions to deal with. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. Keep an eye on our Twitter account and the Conversation website for fact checks by the experts. Our next question comes from Jack Nyhoff.
I'm a 16-year-old high school student and youth activist from Geelong. I'm frustrated, angry, and scared that our government isn't doing enough. Our government currently supports fossil fuels and the construction of the biggest coal mine in the southern hemisphere. Not only is this a violation of Indigenous land rights, but this would be a climate catastrophe. My question is, should the young people of Australia sue our government for inaction on climate, violating our duty of care to the Australian people?
Xiuhtezcatl, we'll start with you.
So I'm currently in a lawsuit with 20 other youth plaintiffs holding our federal government accountable for violating our constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property by failing to take action on climate change. Seeing it as one of the greatest threats to our rights as American citizens. I think that when young people's voices are heard and when young people's voices are brought into the conversation, we have greater diversity, we have a great demonstration of what ideas really lie within a country and within, that represent people. And young people have a very, I say, an interesting perspective that changes the conversation. And for me, I think this is an amazing tactic that we can use because, in our country, our government has failed to take action on climate change. We have failed to do everything that we can to transfer to a renewable energy policy. If we look at fossil fuel infrastructure projects across the country, if we look at the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone Access Pipeline, these are methods of transporting and extracting energy that have been practiced for the last several decades. Where if you look at a cell phone that was made, or a phone, a communication device that was made 50 years ago and one that was made now, it's radically different. If you look at the way that we are still extracting fossil fuels from the ground, not a lot has changed. And so there are so many opportunities for us to transition towards renewable energies. If you look at Australia, you could be 100% renewable energy. It is possible. We don't have to we don't have to dig into the ground for dead plant and animal matter. That's not the future of energy. That is not the future of our country, and that is not the world that we should be passing on to future generations. Young people in the future deserve, a healthy, clean atmosphere where we can breathe the air, we can drink the water, and we can know that our politicians are making decisions on our behalf. I think it is an amazing idea to take the Australian government to court for failing to protect your future by not taking action on climate change.
Okay. Thank you. You might get a few of those moments every now and then, but let's not forget you were actually suing, when you started this lawsuit, you're actually suing the Obama administration. We've got a new administration, Donald Trump. What do you know of his plans for the environment?
I think when we look at Donald Trump's environmental policy, it stacks onto the list of reasons why he does not make a good presidency. When we look at solutions for climate change, when we look at renewable energy, that's not just a plea to help the environment. Growing economies all over the world are beginning to adopt renewable energy resources and a renewable energy platform to grow our economies, to create more jobs and to help people. I think Donald Trump doesn't believe in climate change, and first of all, that's I think a ridiculous notion. I think not believing in climate change is turning your backs on every climate refugee that exists in the world, that has lost their homes, their families, and their communities. I think not believing in climate change turns your back on every life that has been lost. And for a lot of people that are disconnected from the issue of climate change, is maybe because the water has not reached your back door. Maybe because fossil fuel companies are not drilling in your backyard and making your children sick. But I've seen it, and I've been on Skype calls with the president of Kiribati, which is an island nation, and he said to me on this interview that for my people it's too late. Our island nations are sinking, and our communities are being engulfed by the ocean because of the lack of action and because of the action that fossil fuel companies and governments have worked together to create such a huge climate crisis.
Okay, let's go to Josh Frydenberg, Minister for both Energy and Climate Change. So what do you make of what's going to happen to climate policy under Donald Trump?
Well, I can only judge by the words of his incoming Energy Secretary, Rick Perry, who for 15 years was the governor of Texas. And Texas has more wind power than any other state in the United States. And he emphasised in his testimony to the Senate how he values energy security, energy affordability, and he sees an important role for renewables, and he talked about wind power. And I think, obviously, Donald Trump did an interview with the New York Times too, where he said he was open-minded on this issue. Obviously, you had his comments before the election itself. Look, we'll just wait and see. But from
so can I just interrupt there? I mean, your own chief scientist, Alan Finkel, today compared Donald Trump to the Soviet dictator Stalin. He says that under the new president, science is literally under attack. Now, this is the same climate science that underpins Australia's climate policy. Are you at all concerned about what the chief scientist is saying?
Well, I did note that the chief scientist also said in Australia he's never ever been told what to say by the Prime Minister or an Australian minister. And as you know, we have commissioned him to undertake an important review of the nation's energy security. So we value...
But he's talking about America, and the question was about Trump.
Well, that's what he said about Donald Trump, and I am not going to pass judgment on his energy policy when we haven't seen the full details of it, other than to say this. When it comes to climate science, the Turnbull government has just announced another $37 million for the CSIRO. We've made it a core objective of the CSIRO, myself in terms of through the Bureau of Meteorology and the work that we're doing on Macquarie Island. We've just made a $50 million investment, and that will provide important climate data, not just for Australia, but also for the world. We've got our targets, and what we are saying is we need to be technology neutral. Now, we take our emissions reduction seriously.
So I want to hear from American experts here on what Trump might do, but what if he pulls out of the Paris Agreement, just to start with?
Well, again, you want me to speculate on speculation, Tony?
It's pretty strong speculation.
But we've got our targets. We've got policies in place. We're reviewing our policies too. But for us, It's not just about reducing emissions, I have to say. First and foremost, our priority is about energy security because we've got a big wake-up call.
Okay, we're going to come back to that question, and I just want to hear from Helen Andrews. What do you think Donald Trump will do in the area of climate policy?
Well, he won't be as bad as Stalin. That's definitely for sure. In fact, based on the NOAA whistleblower who went public just this week, who revealed that the so-called Pausebuster paper produced under Obama was based on flawed data and flawed models, sounds like they're the ones who are the enemies of science, not Donald Trump. And just to return briefly to the questioner, suing the government over climate change is a terrible idea. It's an undemocratic idea. You know, I would have a lot of respect for Xiuhtezcatl and Earth Guardians if they were climate activists who went around trying to convince people you are. And your grassroots stuff is fantastic. Go around, convince people that they need to care more and do more. But faced with the evidence that the American voters are not on board with your climate alarmism, you have decided to circumvent the voters completely by trying to use a lawsuit to force, just to say, this is why Trump won. Because the American people were sick of liberals losing in the Democratic arena and then deciding to impose their policies on the people against their will through judicial activists and through unaccountable
young
bureaucrats.
People under the age of 18, we actually do not have a right to vote. Young people do not have a right to vote, and my voice and my vote was not necessarily counted when it comes to electing our president and when it comes to electing all of our politicians. So when we look at young people's voices not being heard in a political arena, when we look at young people's voices not even being heard, a lot of times in grassroots activism, organizing fields, we have this perspective where young people are going to be affected more than any generation when we look at any problem that we're facing. Young people are going to be impacted the most. Therefore, we have a right to do something about these problems now, today. And when our voices are not going to be represented by our leaders, our politicians are appointed to represent the voices of the people.
Yes, young people are very persuasive, which is why I think that you and your friends should go out and make your case to the American people rather than inventing a constitutional right to be free of climate change.
Okay, that's a good point to leave that argument. Now, we've got another question. We've got to get through as many questions as we can. We're committed to that tonight. Next question is from Adrian Catt.
Given the irresponsible management of energy resources by the states, particularly Victoria and South Australia, which has resulted in outrageous utility bills for consumers, will the Commonwealth buy back and operate Australia's energy resources, thus future-proofing the economy?
Okay, I'm going to start with Daniel Andrews because we haven't heard from him on this general subject.
Well, there are many views about energy policy and people are entitled to their views. I don't agree, with the greatest of respect, with the comments that you've just made. But what we do have to do is make sure that we recognise any increase in power prices hurts. Depending on the source you use, some data suggests that there was very little increase at all last year in Victoria, maybe a 1% increase. I again say any increase hurts, and the projections for the next 2 years are between a 4% and an 8% increase. That is not good, but it is not the sort of trebling of bills that some people are talking about, which is frankly not right and not particularly helpful when it comes to creating jobs and investment. And that's the key point about a better energy mix. It is about jobs. We've got 5,500 megawatts worth of wind and other renewable energy in the pipeline. That's good for $2.5 billion worth of investment. That's good for 11,000 jobs as we reach our 25% target by 2020 and 40% renewable by 2025. These are real projects. Many of them are already in the ground. And if you go down to Portland and you talk to Keppel Prince, who make the turbines and make the wealth and opportunity that comes from a better and more balanced energy market, they'll tell you very clearly that this is good for industry, good for skills, and good for jobs, particularly in regional Victoria, and it just happens to be good for the planet as well.
Okay, I'm going to quickly go with another question, same subject, Lottie Dawes.
Good evening. Look, as a lot of people realise, people are becoming disillusioned with the major political parties. And politicians, with all their perks, we believe they're too far removed from the ordinary people. Basically, my view is we need politicians who understand the ordinary Australian, many of whom are struggling, paying their bills, and they're really, really struggling. Premier Andrews or Mr. Frydenberg, what are your thoughts on finding a way to have meaningful dialogue with us, the ordinary people, and include us in some of your decision making on important issues, for example, such as electricity price increases. But there are many other issues.
Oh, there are.
You know, we, the ordinary people, feel you're there in your office. You don't come out and talk to us. You don't know how we feel.
Okay, I'm going to start with Josh Frydenberg on this. I'll come back to you, Premier.
Electricity prices is going to be one of those battle lines that you're referring to in terms of, are people listening to the public or are they pursuing an ideological approach? I went to the Latrobe Valley and met with those workers at Hazelwood and their unions. And I was recently in Alcoa with the Premier and the Prime Minister. And the problem with Daniel Andrews' position is it's got an inherent contradiction. He's handing out hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money for the workers at Alcoa and importantly keeping that business going, or to the workers at Hazelwood who have lost their jobs, but he's pursuing policies, whether it's his unrealistically high renewable energy target or his moratorium and bans on unconventional and conventional gas extraction in this state, which is driving up electricity prices, which is hurting households. He referred to the fact that electricity prices are only going up 4 to 8%. His government said that it would go up a fraction of the $135 it's going up this year in Victoria because of the closure of Hazelwood.
Okay, Josh, I'm going to get Daniel Andrews to respond to it because he clearly indicated earlier that's not the case. I know you've been saying it.
Well, Josh, just on the way through, I'll give you the message that I've heard from Victorians right across this state when it comes to fracking and unconventional gas. We're having none of that. So if that's not a message you've heard, I'm happy to take you out to some farms and some other communities where people across regional Victoria know that there's no separating the environment and the economy. A clean green image is too valuable to all of us, to allow those methods and that risk to be at play across our state. So I'm happy to have a debate about
what do you say to Premier? What do you say to Lottie? Because you can address what she's saying. Because there's obviously a huge concern in the community about rising electricity prices, not only in Victoria. And I think you're hearing that grassroots
absolutely
concern.
I am, in lots of different places. And Lottie didn't just speak about energy prices, as important as those issues are. She's talked about a whole range of other things. We've capped local council rates to try and give ordinary Victorians a break. Where did our commitments around using Australian steel when we removed level crossings come from? Came from listening to ordinary Victorians. Our investments in TAFE, our work at Alcoa, our work dealing with the auto industry. Lots of different things that we're doing come exactly from listening to the local community, listening to ordinary Victorians. Can we do more of that? Yeah, I think we probably can. And we're out and about every day. I'm sure Josh does plenty of this as well. You've got to listen, and that's the Trump message. Get things done, listen, remain connected, and make sure that the things you're doing are making the life of those you serve, the ordinary voting public, better and safer.
Okay, well, Lottie's got a hand up. I'll go back to you quickly.
But what I'm saying is you may be having consultation, but are you having meaningful dialogue with ordinary people? What sort of consultation are you having? Well, are you talking to, real people out there in the street?
Yes, I am, yes. And, well, look, we had an election two years ago. We put out a clear set of policies, and I can tell you we had more than 100 different events like this, some with 200 or 300 people, some with 2 or 3 people. And it was about listening to ordinary members of the public about the things that were important to them. When you go and repair the damage done in our TAFE system, for instance, I can tell you that comes from talking to ordinary, hard-working Victorians who say, this is not good enough. We're not having this. We want our kids to get the skills that they need. And there's 100 more examples like that. But look,
you can't go through 100 examples, so just give us a quick summary point so we can move on.
I think we're in agreement, though. All governments need to do more and do better at this and always remain focused on not ourselves, but on the people we serve. And listening is a really important part of that.
Okay, now I'm just going to quickly go back to Josh Frydenberg. There's something we didn't deal with from the first question, and that is the idea the federal government would actually put money into the energy sector, and you've talked about that. You've talked about taking money from directing the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to actually pay for or finance coal-fired power stations in different parts of this country. Isn't that picking winners? Isn't that exactly what Liberals are not supposed to do?
We have a renewable energy target which is confined to funding wind and solar. So you could argue that that is picking winners. The point about our approach is it's going to be technology neutral. We recognise that there are a lot of advancements happening around clean coal and carbon capture and storage. It was referred to by Alan Finkel in his report. Obviously, we are seeing more renewable sources of power into the system, but people need to understand this is an engineering challenge, not just an environmental one or an economic one.
Okay, but briefly on that engineering challenge, a 1,000 megawatt power station of the type that you're talking about is supposed to cost around $3 to $5 billion. That's for one. How many of those are you planning to build?
Well, obviously, there are differing costs about whether you retrofit an existing power station. We have 24 in Australia, but we don't have any of what are called these ultra supercritical power stations. There are more than 700 of those throughout Asia. I visited one in Yokohama, Japan, fuelled by Australian coal. There is a transition taking place. Alan Finkel calls it the biggest in over a century in our energy system. What we're saying as a government is we need to listen to the people about electricity affordability because it's a hip pocket issue. In South Australia, 1 in 5 households are spending less on groceries and other compulsory items because they've got these rising electricity bills. That's where it's really hitting, and as well as energy security. So we're trying to deal with the trilemma.
All right, we've got to move on. You're watching Q&A live and interactive, where we're launching an experiment tonight. We call it Q&A Extra. It's your chance to push the debate along after the panel stops talking. So you can join Tracy Holmes on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live straight after this program to vent or applaud. And go ahead and do that. So our next question comes from Sophie Clark.
Premier Andrews, I, like many Victorians, had a close friend witness the horror on Bourke Street. I, like many Victorians, was astonished to see 15 SKP steel cars, petrol, and endanger Victorians. I am well aware of your government's recent initiatives to tackle crime, including additional police and a new youth detention centre. But your government is still failing to provide the right support. The latest Youth Parole Board report highlights 63% were victims of abuse, trauma or neglect. 66% had a history of both drug and alcohol misuse. These youths are showing no respect for the law and for the city we live in. Will you go further to find a solution as to why these youths are resorting to crime?
Okay, we've got a few questions on this, so keep it relatively concise.
Sophie, thanks for your question, and I know this is a concern and an issue that is relevant to every single Victorian, myself included, obviously. We've made some announcements in recent times, and you've already alluded to those, so I won't go through that. On Bourke Street, can I just say that, you know, this was a terrible, evil crime. These matters are going to be before the courts and the coroner, so we're a bit limited in what we can say, but all of us, you know, our hearts were breaking when we saw what occurred to everybody. Those 6 people that have lost their lives, to their families, we send our very best wishes and our ongoing support. And of course, there's still 6 people, I think, in hospital, one of whom is critical, and our thoughts are with them as well. We've announced some reform in relation to bail, and we will make the change that honours those people who have died and their memory, and make sure we get the balance right to reassert that the first consideration and the most important consideration is the safety of the community. In terms of police resources, I've said many times the Chief Commissioner will have what he needs, and that's what we are providing. Youth justice is both the resources and the facilities that are needed to maintain order and guarantee the security of those youth justice facilities, and I've made some announcements about that as early as today. But youth justice is much more complex than that. Once you've achieved that, as important as that is, you've then got to look at what's never excusing the behaviour we've seen, but trying to explain it, deal with the causes, and deal with... We don't want that treadmill where people basically go from being a juvenile offender to then becoming an adult offender and spending their life in jail at great cost to the Victorian taxpayer, and who knows what cost to their victims along the way.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you just so that we can just bring in the next question, and then I'll get the whole panel in discussing this issue. But the next question is from Michael Weinberg.
Yep, Premier Andrews, in light of the recent violent and dangerous episodes of Victorian youth detention centres, is it time to redefine the law around youth offenders who are in every other way than age, not children? Should these type of offenders at the centre of the rights be treated as adults?
A couple of points. This is a very important point. We made some announcements today and last week around Corrections Victoria staff being in charge of these youth justice facilities. They've got the skills, they've got the training, and they're looking after keeping these facilities as secure as possible. I've also said that we're going to have more to say around substantial reform, and I think the point you've made, it's just about common sense. People's conduct should define the way in which they are managed and the way in which the risk they pose to community safety is managed.
So you are just to confirm this, and briefly, you are literally contemplating the idea of treating offenders under the age of 18 as adults.
No, the point that I was about to make was at the centre of your question is whether it's adult or not, the notion of a different approach to those who are serious youth offenders, violent youth offenders. If I take your meaning correctly, that's what I'm about. And we'll have more to say about that quite soon.
Okay, I'm wary to give this to the politicians. I want everyone to respond, but Josh, you want to jump in, go ahead.
Well, as a Melburnian, as a father, I share Daniel Andrews' heartbreak about what happened, and I want to commend Daniel and his government for the compassionate way they responded, setting up this fund. And I've said this privately to Dan because we were together that day.
We were.
In Alcoa in Portland before it actually broke. I don't think Victorians have ever felt as unsafe as they do now. I think people are worried about home invasions, carjackings. The numbers tell the story. Burglaries are up 21% year on year in Victoria. Assaults are up 11%, murders are up 9%. I couldn't believe it when I read in the paper that somebody who went into a home invasion beat to a pulp the guy in his house, threatened his partner with rape, dragged him across the road, and is going to get out of jail in less than 2 years. That is not tolerable, right? And we have to have zero tolerance. And I'm...
Okay, Josh, I'm going to tell you, we've only got a few minutes left in the program.
So
I need to jump on to the other panellists.
The federal government is working very closely with state governments on an anti-gang task force with an ICE strategy and in a whole lot of other areas. But we needed more police a long time ago, not just announced at the end of last year. We needed a supermax prison for these violent youth offenders a long time ago. And we didn't need to
Our other guests are going to have
laws.
limited time to respond. Xiuhtezcatl, you've seen this. I mean, in many states in the United States, they treat underage offenders as adults.
The way that I would respond to this is that there's two really important parts to address this problem. And one of it is obviously dealing with offenders after they commit crimes. And I think another thing is how do we figure out how to work within our community so that it doesn't happen again? You know, if you look at the Bronx in the early 70s, and it was one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in all the United States where there was all kinds of violence. And if you look at one of the huge things that helped bring people together, limit the amount of violence, and really change the face of what was happening there was music. If you look at hip hop, if you look at the power that hip hop had to actually bring young people together in spaces where they were gathering that wasn't violent, that wasn't harmful to the communities, it changed a lot. When we give young people an ability and an outlet to engage in the world and to do something positive, to focus their energy on something positive and make an actual difference in their community, like that is powerful. So I think the prosecution is a very, very important aspect of this, but also how can we work within our communities to empower young people, their voices, their ideas, their ideals, so that they can feel a part of the community as anyone else.
Daisy, I'll give you the final word on this because we're nearly out of time.
I really do agree with you on this. I don't think it's ever acceptable to put children in adult prisons for all of the obvious reasons, but I do agree with you because I think you've got to attack this problem with young people at the source. It's not enough to shove them through the prison system and try to rehabilitate them and punish them again and again. It just perpetuates the cycle. And as someone who comes from a theatre background and a musical background, I've seen what music can do. I've seen what theatre can do. I can see how it can bring people together. It brings the shyest people out of their shells. It's therapeutic. It's uplifting. It makes you laugh. It makes you cry. And I think if there were more programs like that, if there were more people like you, I think you're fantastic, by the way. I think everything you do is fantastic. I'm sure sure we disagree on a lot of things, but I do think you're fantastic.
Well, that's a perfect note of agreement for us to end the program, which we have to because we're out of time. Please thank our panel: Helen Andrews, Daniel Andrews, Daisy Cousens, Xiuhtezcatl, Martinez, Josh Frydenberg, and this great Melbourne audience. Right, thank you very much. Now, if you want to continue the discussion, join Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and her guest Georgina Downer as they pick apart tonight's Q&A on ABC News Radio. They'll be responding to your social media comments and questions and taking talkback calls as well. Q&A Extra kicks off as soon as we finish, and you can listen to ABC News Radio or watch it on Facebook Live. Next Monday on Q&A, the Shadow Education Minister Kate Ellis, Liberal Senator James Patterson, and author, rev head and engineer Yasmin Abdel Majid. We'll see you then. Good night.